Welcome everybody to today's Tyne and Weir Geographical Association talk, the last of our autumn season. Hopefully you all have a good Christmas break after today's talk. My name is Peter Glaze. I've been asked to do the introduction for this evening's talk, which will be from Mark Goddard at Northumbria University on concrete jungles, the value of urban ecosystems for biodiversity. So for those who listened to last week's talk from Andy Suggett, there's a little bit of a theme and some potential links there in terms of geography and biodiversity, this time with a strong, obviously urban focus. In terms of today's event, everyone is welcome to join the event, whether you're a GA member or not. As we normally have to say at this point, all our talks are free to attend live or to watch online. If anyone wishes to donate towards the running of the GA in the Tyne and Weir region, or in fact join the GA, just put your email details into the comments box and we can send you further information. We have a number of talks organised, in fact I think a full set for the spring term, so starting in mid-January and running through to about Easter. I'll be able to give you the titles of the first 2 or 3 talks at the end of today's session, and we will in due course send you the full list. If, however, there are particular topics that you'd like to see as one of the Monday talk sessions, again, put some suggestions into the comments box and we will see if we can get them organised for you. For those of you, if you're in years 12 and 13, I've been asked to draw your attention to the Geographical Association's Geography and Education Online, or as it's known, the GEO website. Lots of useful material there in terms of studying the subject. In terms of the audience, happy for you to mute yourselves in terms of audio and video. If you do want to show yourself on screen, that's always useful for the speaker to know that there's actually someone at the other end listening. I would ask you though to mute yourselves until we get to the question and answer session at the end. It's always a bit distracting if you can hear someone in the background. In terms of questions, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the comment box at any point. And we've organised some time at the end of today's session for a question and answer slot. If there's a question you'd like to ask yourself, can you just put the word ask in? If you'd rather I read out your question, just type in the question and I will read it out for you. If anyone attending wishes to get a copy of a certificate of attendance, some people find that useful for their transcripts, or they just like having a certificate, then again, just put your name and your email into the comments box. So having done the general introduction, I would like now to introduce today's speaker. Today's speaker is Mark Goddard from Northumbria University. Mark Goddard is Vice Chancellor Research Fellow at Northumbria University, and more importantly, he's an urban ecologist with a particular interest in how we can improve our cities for both nature and people. His research at PhD level, completing Leeds in 2012, focused on the value of private gardens for wildlife. He has since been working on a range of research projects in the UK and beyond, looking at pollinators, carbon capture in soils, and the emergence of robots and how they may transfer our urban ecosystems. Potential interesting question there. He started work at Northumbria University back in 2019, just about in time for the lockdown. He splits his time between teaching, research projects, and developing new ideas in this theme of urban biodiversity. In terms of the topic for today's talk, if we look at the majority of the world's population, those populations live in cities. Continued urbanisation is an important contributor to the biodiversity crisis. Traditionally, we think of our urban areas as concrete jungles only able to support a depauperate, a limited flora and fauna. Perhaps thinking about things like rats, pigeons, weedy plants, etc. This talk will explore the findings of recent research that disputes this view, drawing on both UK and global examples and scale studies to reveal the wider value of urban ecosystems for biodiversity. So enough of me. I will stop sharing the introductory slide and hand over to Mark. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Peter. And yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen here, so bear with me. Okay, Peter, could you just confirm you're seeing that full screen for me, please? Yeah, great, thank you. Let's see if I can minimize myself there as well, so I'm not seeing my picture in the middle of my screen. Okay, so as Peter, so helpfully explained, I'm going to be talking today about the value of cities for biodiversity, how important cities can be for biodiversity. But as I was preparing this talk, I also realized that it is also important to highlight that, excuse me, that biodiversity also, we need to think about it of the value of biodiversity for people at the same time. So cities are important places for biodiversity, but at the same time, of course, biodiversity is very important for people in cities. So that's, I guess, going to be the sort of two contrasting views that I'm going to be talking about today. But I thought it might be helpful just to give a little bit of background about myself, where I'm coming from, especially for some of those who might be thinking about a career in geography or ecology. Okay, so I actually did 3 A levels, including geography, biology, and English, and then I went on to study zoology at the University of Nottingham. So that's basically biology without the plants. At the time, I didn't really realise the value of plants, and I've come to appreciate those over time. And then I went on to study a master's, and that was in ecology, and environmental management at York University. And then I sort of finished my education, if you like, although we're always learning, I guess, with a PhD at the University of Leeds. And I think Peter mentioned there that was focusing on the value of gardens for biodiversity. But I've also done a range of other things. So in between my undergrad and my master's degree, I was a volunteer for about a year at the Conservation Volunteers. And after my master's degree, I spent about a year again working at the Wildlife Trust, and actually down in Teesside, a project where I was actually investigating the value of urban streams for water voles down in Teesside in Middlesbrough. And you can see me there, well, if you can tell, dressed up as a water vole. It's not the most convincing outfit I think anyone's ever seen. And I also, again, before starting my PhD, I spent some time working as an ecological consultant. So, yeah, I guess I've drawn upon all these different experiences and brought them into my academic career. And as Peter said, I'm now a research fellow at Northumbria, but I've sort of before that worked on a range of different urban ecology projects in Leeds and also at Newcastle University. So that's I guess enough about me, and let's see what we're going to talk about today. So I guess there are 5 main sort of areas that we're going to touch on today. I'm going to start with some background, covering the challenge of urbanisation, the scale of urbanisation, and also some background on biodiversity as a bit of a recap for those who may not be too familiar with that concept. We're then going to move on to talk about how urbanisation actually affects biodiversity, and then come on to the important role that cities have in terms of providing habitat for the conservation of biodiversity. And then, as I said, we're going to flip that around and think about, well, what benefits does biodiversity in cities actually bring to people? Okay, and then finally, going to think about some key challenges moving forward for trying to sort of manage our urban green spaces for biodiversity. But to start, and just to provide a little bit of background context, I'm hoping to play this video, which was produced by the Stockholm Resilience Centre. So to do that, I'm just going to stop sharing my PowerPoint, bring up to YouTube. So just bear with me one moment while I do that. Okay.
This is the story about how the world will look in 2030 and beyond. It is the story of how urbanization will change the surface of our planet and the biodiversity that is an essential part of it. Over the next 40 years, Earth will undergo the largest and fastest period of urban growth in human history. By 2050, an additional area the size of South Africa is projected to become urban. By then, 6.3 billion people will live in towns and cities, an increase of 2.8 billion from 2010. A more than doubling of the world's urban population in just 40 years. The most rapid and extensive urban expansion is occurring in places adjacent to some of the world's most biodiversity-rich areas. In many of these areas, people have limited economic and technical resources to deal with the challenges that come with the growth. But urbanization also provides opportunities. Cities are hubs of change. Cities can and must take the lead for sustainable development. Cities can provide the solutions to conserve and protect nature and the ecosystems we depend on. Because we know that rich biodiversity can exist in cities, and urban ecosystems can significantly improve human health and well-being. We know that more conscious lifestyles and smarter development can help protect and support a rich biodiversity both inside and outside of urban areas. Well-functioning ecosystems can help reduce risks of water shortage, droughts, storms, and heat waves. They can help to curb environmental degradation. That is why unleashing the potential of cities is vital to securing our sustainable future.
Okay, right. Let's get my PowerPoint back up in 1 second. Okay, so hopefully that's back up now. So yeah, that was just really a quick overview to help us understand the scale of urbanization, but also touched on that, didn't it? The real role that cities can play, and it's going to be a taster of the topic that I'm going to talk about throughout this talk. Okay, so let's go back in time a little bit now then, and just really quickly recap some history of urbanization. Okay, so it's been about sort of 5,000 or 6,000 years since cities really emerged on the scene. And although academics aren't exactly sure about the exact sort of driver of what caused urbanization to happen, the likely scenario is that basically that people realized that if they were sedentary, they could actually pursue agriculture and other sort of facilities which would be able to stop them needing to move around and live a sort of nomadic lifestyle. And it was Mesopotamia that's the first region of the world which became urbanized. That's sort of modern day Iraq. If you're interested in the sort of the history of urbanization and some of the problems that actually emerged and plagued some of these urban societies, I'd really recommend this book by Jared Diamond. Okay, many of you may have seen it already. It's called Collapse, and it explains how societies in the past, some of these early sort of urban civilizations were actually really plagued by environmental problems. And in fact, it actually eventually led to the collapse of some civilizations entirely. And Jared Diamond actually goes on to explain some of the lessons that we might be able to learn as a human society nowadays for perhaps trying to, avoid the same fate as some of these early societies. So it's well worth having a look at that book. But of course, it's only relatively recently that urbanization has been happening on the scale that we now know it. Okay, so this figure here is showing us that it's only in the last really 200 years or so that migration to towns and cities has happened at any sort of a scale. So you can see from down the bottom left here that, you know, prior to about 1600, you know, about less than 5% of people were living in sort of urban settings. And by 1800, you know, it increased a little bit to 7%, and then we see this sort of exponential increase in people living in urban areas. And you can see there a number of different regions as well there. United Kingdom, by 2016, we had over 80% of people living within cities, for example. Now, I'm not sure how well this is going to work, considering we haven't got too many people on the call, but there's a question for you, okay? I don't know if anyone can maybe type in the chat, or it might be something for Peter here, who can have a guess. What actually happened on the 23rd of May, 2007? Sort of a milestone in terms of urban development and as a human, you know, in our human society. Any guesses, any ideas? I can give you a clue and say that it wasn't this, okay, which also happened on the 23rd of May, which was AC Milan beating Liverpool 2-1 in the UEFA Champions League final. So it wasn't that. I don't know if we've got any other guesses. If I can see the chat here.
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. Okay, I might have to tell you the answer then. So it was basically the world became more than 50% urbanized for the first time. So more than 50% of the world's human population was living in cities in 2007. You can see here this crossover point. So we became a predominantly urban species. Okay, and then since then you can then see projecting forward into sort of 2030, 2050. You know, that we're expecting the vast majority of people to start living in cities, and we'll see that, I think, in some of these coming slides. So by 2020, about 56% of us lived in urban settlements, and you can see there again that it very much differs with different regions. It's actually near North America where that is predominantly urban compared to other regions. And if we look even forward even further, by 2030, we're expecting about 60% of people to live in cities, and by 2050, over 2/3 of us, by which time there'll be nearly 10 billion people on the planet. Okay, so I think we can all appreciate that, you know, urbanization is happening. It's a major issue. Okay, and if we're gonna be able to, you know, deal sustainably with this urban growth, we're going to have to think about ways of promoting biodiversity within our cities, and that's what we're going to be thinking about today. But really, before I sort of delve into how urbanization actually affects biodiversity, I think it might be useful just to quickly give a recap about, you know, what biodiversity is exactly. Okay, so the term actually emerged at the Rio Summit here. This is the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. The Earth Summit was also known as. This was back in 1992. And all it was is basically a contraction of the words biological and diversity. And it captures this idea of the different variety of life on Earth, okay? There is a much more formal definition, which was sort of provided by the conference here, and it sort of gets upon this idea that there's actually different levels of biodiversity. Okay, so it can talk about diversity within species, diversity between species, and also diversity of ecosystems. And we just have a quick look at some examples of that now, I think. So yeah, this is this idea here that, you know, we can talk about diversity actually at the genetic level. Okay, a very famous example here is the huge variety of characteristics of dogs, which of course, you know, humans are bred for their various different needs. Okay, but it's still just a single species. Okay, this is you know, where it's, you know, genes on chromosomes are actually determining these characteristics. So we can talk about genetic diversity, but I guess normally the main things that people talk about when they're talking about biodiversity is species diversity. Okay, and here we can see a lovely image of the diversity of beetles. I think there's over 350,000 species of beetle known to science, probably many more as well that haven't been described yet. That's species diversity, but we can also talk about ecosystem diversity, so the variety of these, you know, different sort of broader scale habitats, whether it's marine ecosystems, desert ecosystems, rainforests, and of course urban ecosystems. And finally, we can also talk about functional diversity. And this is starting to think about the roles or the functions that organisms are doing within communities, within ecosystems. There's an example there of the functional diversity of microorganisms and all the various roles that they play. And actually many of which are very beneficial to human society, of course. Okay, so that's a sort of an overview of biodiversity, and I'm just going to touch quickly on some ways in which we measure biodiversity, because we'll be talking about some of these concepts today. I guess the common way that we measure biodiversity, or the most familiar way for many of us, is the idea of species richness. Okay, so the number of different species. Okay, but actually that's somewhat limited in terms of how useful it can be, and more sort of complicated measurements of biodiversity, or more sophisticated measurements, will actually take into account evenness, this idea of the relative abundance of different species. And you can see in this example here that in these two different sort of forest communities, in both cases, the species richness is the same. You can see tree species A, B, C, and D. But of course, in the first example, there's much greater evenness. There's 25% of each of the species, whereas in that second example in community 2, it's very much dominated by species A. Okay, and in that sense, this idea of evenness is giving us a much better sense of the sort of the true diversity. This is especially important, of course, when you think about the roles and the functions that these different species might be playing in the community. Okay, so these are just some background really on these different concepts. Okay, and you probably don't need me to tell you, of course, that biodiversity is currently in crisis. Okay, so scientists consider that we're actually currently in what's known as the Holocene extinction event, which is the 6th mass extinction on Earth. It's all very depressing, but we see biodiversity declining faster now than it has at any other time in human history. And indeed, the current rate of species extinction is thought to be somewhere between 10 or 100 times faster than the average rate that has occurred during even the last several billion years. Okay, and there's some more sobering facts here that, even though as humans we represent just 0.01% of all living creatures, we've actually caused a loss of 83% of wild mammals, for example, and 50% of plants. And yeah, the IUCN is I guess the body that documents this more than any other, and they produce a red list each year of the world's threatened species, and the numbers seem to go up each year. If you follow this, at the moment there's more than 38,000 species that are threatened with extinction, and that's just 28% of all the species that have been assessed. Of course, there's only a small fraction of species that are studied. So it's very much a fairly depressing state of biodiversity decline that we're in at the moment. And it's also fair to say that humans are responsible for many of the drivers of biodiversity decline as well. So this is an image that comes from IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's a little bit too much detail on here for us to really pull everything out. But if you just have a look at the direct drivers on the left-hand side here of sort of biodiversity decline, you see that many of them are, of course, related to human impact and even urbanization. If you think about land use change, climate change, of course, cities are hubs for CO2 production, which is driving climate change, amongst other things. Pollution is also listed in there. Of course, industrial activity is often centered around cities. Invasive alien species are mentioned there as well. Often cities are hotspots for introduced species. Okay, so it's fair to say that cities are really, and urbanization is having a big impact on biodiversity, and we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail shortly. And just finally, just really a reminder of why this all matters. Okay, so you probably don't need me to remind you that we all, as all humans, all species, we depend on biodiversity for various services, okay, various benefits that it brings, for us to be have a functional and sustainable society. Okay, so things, for example, there's various provisioning services that are provided by biodiversity, such as materials for food and fuel, of course. Biodiversity also underpins sort of regulating ecosystem services, things like pollination provided by insects and other animals. They're also supporting processes like water purification, nutrient cycling, and finally, the recreational opportunities as well that we need in order to stay sort of healthy and have a good state of mental well-being. Okay, so as human society, biodiversity really underpins everything that we need to sort of survive, and also to have sort of high health and well-being. Okay, so we're going to move on now to sort of think a bit more specifically about how urbanisation actually affects biodiversity sort of directly. Okay, so what we see is that the process of urbanisation, the development, the construction of cities, the growth of cities, it actually alters both the biotic and the abiotic properties of ecosystems. Okay, so when we talk about biotic, we mean the living components, and the abiotic are the sort of the non-living components, sort of like the microenvironment. Okay, and we're going to focus on a number of different aspects here. Okay, firstly, loss and fragmentation of habitats. I guess it's quite straightforward that as cities are developed, the habitat that they're built on top of is lost or it's fragmented, but it's also highly disturbed. Okay, so we see cities that are characterized by sort of very much unique microenvironments, and we'll come on to that as well. And we also see, compared to sort of the species that might be living in the surrounding region, we see changes in species composition within cities, and that talks about the types of species that are able to survive there. And in particular, we see invasions of non-native species, so species that wouldn't typically be found. They've been introduced into that area, and they've often been brought in there by humans directly or indirectly. And we also see extinctions of native species. And this has actually led us to worry that urbanisation is causing what we call homogenization of biodiversity. This idea that urban communities or the species of plants and animals that we see in cities around the world are actually becoming the same. And we'll sort of explore whether that's the case or not a little bit later. Okay, so first of all, let's sort of try and quantify or have a think a bit more about the impact of urbanisation specifically on habitat. Okay, so a key mantra, I guess, within biodiversity conservation is that we're looking always to create bigger, better, and more joined up habitat. Now, unfortunately, it's often the opposite in cities. Okay, so we often see that urbanisation is associated with habitat loss, so maybe sort of smaller, less habitat. It's also associated with disturbance of habitat, so instead of having better habitat, we have worse habitat, and also fragmentation. So rather than having more joined up, connected habitat, we actually have habitats which are less joined up and more disconnected from each other. So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. So here's an example. I think this is from Brisbane in Australia. And it's helping us, I guess, to just try and think a little bit more about exactly what we mean by habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. So habitat loss, quite straightforward. It just means the decrease in spatial extent of natural habitat. And we can see in these various images here that as residential land is built, in this case, on this sort of forested habitat, you're obviously seeing that the amount of natural forest habitat is lost as we move from A to D in these images. But at the same time that the habitat is being lost, we're also seeing habitat fragmentation. Okay, so this is actually looking at how the habitat is being broken apart, but controlling for habitat loss. So we're not just seeing, we're not seeing one large sort of piece of habitat that's retained, for example, in the center, but we're seeing that all of the habitat is broken up into many, many smaller fragments. And this, of course, affects the ability for species to be able to sort of persist, but also to be able to move between these habitat patches, because for some species, it's very difficult for them to be able to disperse across these various boundaries. Okay, so what has all this actually meant in sort of quantitative terms. Okay, so this is a figure that comes from some work by Rob McDonald, who's actually estimated the amount of habitat that's been lost since the year, well, before the year 2000, caused by urban growth. And if you actually have a look here, they're forecasting that there's nearly 300,000 kilometers of natural habitat that is forecast to be converted to urban land between the year 2000 and the year 2030. Okay, and to put that into context, I've noted there that the area of the UK is about 242,000 square kilometres. So we're talking about an area of sort of natural habitat bigger than the UK being lost to urban land, okay, which is quite astounding if you think of it like that. Here's another quite disturbing headline that sort of emerged last year, and this is this idea that man-made, human-made stuff, okay, now actually outweighs the biomass of all living things. Okay, so we can see in these figures here that you know, buildings and infrastructure are now sort of 1,100 gigatons, and this is larger than the amount of biomass which is locked up within sort of trees and shrubs and also animals. Okay, so this happened for the first time in human history in 2020. So whatever way we look at it, okay, urbanization, our sort of human societies are having a major impact on natural habitats. And so we've talked about habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, but of course, the habitats that are retained within cities are often very disturbed. Okay, I haven't really got time to go into this in too much detail today, but we see that, for example, cities are characterized by having elevated temperature. So there's a well-documented urban heat island effect, and this can, of course, affect the timing of events. So we see, for example, maybe flowering plants flowering earlier within cities than they do in the surrounding land and surrounding landscapes. We also see that cities have very altered hydrology often. Clearly there's an increase in impervious, sort of impermeable surface, which often causes increases in flooding, but the waterways are often channelized, and you know, everything about the natural hydrological system in cities is often highly altered. And then of course we see high levels of air pollution, which can affect nutrient dynamics, and in particular things like nitrogen levels are often very, very high in cities, and that has a fertilization effect, and it can affect the types of plants which are found unable to survive and flourish in urban environments. And then finally, we also see high levels of both noise and light pollution, and that can very much disrupt ecological networks. You can see an example here. Bats can be, of course, distracted by urban lighting. It can also affect, you know, noise pollution can affect the ability of birds and other animals to be able to call and communicate to each other. You know, for example, we see some species of bird actually start to call earlier in the day to try and overcome sort of traffic noise and things like that. Okay, so we're actually seeing species able to evolve and adapt to these urban conditions. Okay, so what type of species are able to succeed in cities? Okay, so I guess early attempts to talk about this topic saw sort of three classifications emerge. This was quite crude, I guess, but yeah, urban ecologists would talk about urban exploiters, and these were the very, very successful species that were highly tolerant of the disturbance that we've been talking about. So things like pigeons, feral pigeons, and brown rats, and so on. And then we also talked about urban adapters, and these are sort of species that are able to tolerate sort of moderately or urbanized or suburban areas. So raccoons are a good example from North America, and I also think that raccoons were recorded in Sunderland not too long ago, so that could be an interesting introduced species. And then finally, this idea of urban avoiders, which are not very tolerant at all of urban habitats, and would often only be found in sort of remnants, fragments of more natural habitat, and they'd be very sensitive. So that was quite a crude way of sort of trying to classify the species that are able to survive in cities, and now more sophisticated attempts are emerging, and these sort of think about actually how the traits of different species might help us to describe or explain how well they can do in cities. There's an example here from urban birds, and we see that birds that are found in cities typically have a higher survival. It could be because there's reduced predation pressure, for example, but they also might have a sort of a lower reproductive success because they have smaller clutch sizes. So they can live longer, but more sort of slower pace of life, if you like, as it's sort of explained in this image here. So that's just one example, but clearly it's very, very complex, and there's various different strategies that species might sort of take on to try to maximize their performance within cities. Now, I guess an important point here when we think about the urban communities is that we have this idea that just some sort of disturbance can actually filter species traits. So we can imagine at the top here that you've got a regional species pool. This could be, for example, the species that are living in Northumberland or Durham, around Newcastle, and it's made up of sort of generalist species which are sort of quite adaptable to a range of conditions, and also specialists which are relying on sort of specific habitats. Okay, and then if we apply this disturbance gradient, and I think you can imagine like an urbanization gradient here, okay, what we start to see is that actually you get this filtering of traits, and that eventually under high levels of disturbance or high levels of urbanization, we tend to see this idea of you're getting generalist species that are leading to this idea of a homogenized community. So it's basically all of the species are converging on the same sort of ecological niche, and you're getting the same sort of functional role that are played by the different species in that community. Okay, and that's this idea of biotic homogenization. Okay, so we've talked then, quite length now about the scale of urbanization and the impact that it has on biodiversity. But now I want to think about actually, how cities and their urban habitats can actually be very important for biodiversity. Now, the first thing to say is that we've talked, I guess, about the impact of urbanization on biodiversity, but we forget that cities are actually very, very diverse places. Okay, so across the UK, there's about 1.8 million hectares of urban area. Okay, or across the Great Britain, I should say. And actually, about 30% of that is classified as natural land cover. And you can see here, this is an example from Leeds. You can see the black and the grey are the sort of urban land covers, but you can see, especially as you move out from the city centre, many sort of shades of green, woodland, parks, and the light green is the gardens here. Okay, so private gardens are a major urban land cover. They can cover sort of 25 to 30% of cities, often about 50% of the urban green space. So when we talk about cities, we have to remember that there is actually a huge variety of different habitats within the area, within urban areas. So they're and some of which can actually be quite rare and are very, very novel now in the landscape. Here's just an example from a paper that I was involved in a few years ago, and this talks about a range of urban habitats. On the left-hand side, we have what we might imagine sort of remnant, sort of natural or semi-natural habitat, which you can see here obviously has sort of low levels of management intensity and high levels of species diversity. And as we move from left to right along this this diagram, we're seeing a different range of habitats, maybe sort of wetlands, urban wastelands like brownfield land, managed parks, through to gardens, and eventually really sort of novel habitats like green roofs, which are created as part of sort of green infrastructure. Also got obviously getting green walls and other sort of habitats now as well. Again, as we move towards this right-hand side, we're getting the much more sort of highly managed, highly engineered, if you like, habitats that are more expensive as well to maintain, and typically might also support less sort of native species diversity as well. But it's important to remember there is this sort of huge heterogeneity of habitat types within urban areas, which makes them really, really quite important. Okay, so now I want to draw upon a global study that I was lucky enough to be involved with a few years ago now. And it was really, I guess, looking at a global scale at the impact of urbanisation on biodiversity for the first time. Okay, so there, I guess, a couple of questions really. I mean, firstly, it was looking at, quite straightforwardly, how much biodiversity is found in cities, focusing on birds and plants. We're also interested in whether native or non-native species are supported, and also whether cities can support rare or endangered species. If you're interested, this is the paper. I can send a copy of it for more interest. You can see lots and lots of different researchers involved. So I'm just one of a big team here. And this is what we did for this particular project. So unfortunately, we weren't able to go out to all these cities across the world and collect primary data. So this was a secondary data exercise, which meant we're mainly stuck inside looking at sort of data sets of the, on a computer, even though we were actually in California at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. This is in Santa Barbara in California. You can see they did let us out sometimes to wander around the city and look at green spaces and so on. But principally, it was a sort of a secondary analysis of existing data sets. Okay, so what we did was we compiled a database of urban birds and plants. Okay, you can see here the various cities for which we collected data. So we had bird data from 54 cities across the world. They're in red here. You can see that the inset from Europe there, because we had an awful lot of cities from Europe. So bird data from 54 cities, plant data from 110 cities. And we had 36 countries across the globe represented. And we also had data from 6 biogeographical realms. Of course, you can see here a huge bias of studies in Europe, and also lots in North America, much fewer in South America, Africa, places like that. And this is what we found. Okay, so the first result was maybe unsurprising, that when we compared the amount of species of birds and plants in the city compared to a similar area outside of the city, okay, the undeveloped land, we found that there were far fewer species. Okay, that was, I guess, what we expect, of course, and it goes with all the theory that we've been talking about. But here's a much more striking headline. Okay, we actually found that there were at least 20% of the world's bird species occurred in those 54 cities. Okay, so we recorded over 2,000 species of bird out of about 10,000 there are in the world, just in those 54 cities. Okay, and similarly, there was 5% of the world's plant species, that's over 14,000, found in those 110 cities. And we say at least here because we know that this is an underestimate. If you look at these graphs down here, okay, this is the species richness of plants on the left and birds on the right. And this is basically what we call a species accumulation curve. Okay, and you can see that, you know, these graphs aren't really showing any signs of reaching a plateau or leveling out quite yet. And that means that if we're able to have got data for more cities, we would have seen an increase in the number of birds and plants on these lists. Okay, so we know that this is an underestimate. So, you know, really quite a striking result in terms of just the sheer number of species that we found in these cities. So this was really quite unexpected. As I said, we're also interested in whether or not these species were native or non-native, and as we can see, the majority were actually native. Okay, so on the right hand side here, this is the birds, and we have in nearly all cases, you can see it's not too clear, but the E is exotic, non-native, the N is native, and the different colors represent the different realms or regions. Okay, but you can see in nearly all cases, the sort of the right hand plot is much higher, which is showing the proportion of birds, especially those that are native, is much higher. So about 94% of bird species were native. The real anomaly there is Australasia. On the right hand side here, you can see it was only about 70% of bird species in Australasia were native, and there's many reasons why we can talk about that as an anomaly. But overall, the vast majority of birds were native. And on the left-hand side as well, similarly, we had about 70% of plant species which were native in those cities. And the other important thing to say here is that we recorded for the plants just sort of spontaneously growing wild plants. So we didn't include lists of sort of cultivated flora, which people might plant in their gardens or in parks and things like that. But on the right-hand side of this plant figure, you can actually see that the in Australasia, it's actually about 50-50 in terms of the split between exotic and native species. But elsewhere, the majority of species are native. Okay, so these are just some of the most common plants recorded in cities worldwide. These were all the species that were found in at least 90% of cities. And if actually you walked around Newcastle or anywhere in the northeast, maybe not in the middle of winter, but later on in the spring or summer, you shouldn't have too much problem finding these sort of species if you know what you're looking for. So annual meadow grass there, shepherd's purse, cleavers, okay, all sorts of familiar plants to you there. So these are the cosmopolitan urban exploiters of the plant world. And similarly for birds, okay, these are the 4 bird species that were found in 80% of cities. Rock dove, the sort of the common pigeon, house sparrow, barn swallow, and European starling. Now, interestingly, house sparrow and European starling are actually both now declining red list species within the UK, but elsewhere they've been introduced around the world and they're doing very well in places like North America. So what on earth is going on there in terms of decreases in the UK and expansion elsewhere is quite hard, and is actually an active area of research. And finally, we're also interested in whether or not these cities could support endangered species. Okay, and we found that actually threatened bird species were actually recorded in 1/3 of cities. Okay, there's one example there. That's the orange-bellied parrot, which is critically endangered. It actually only breeds in Tasmania, but it was actually recorded in Melbourne, and it was included in our data set. Okay, similarly, there's about 8% of cities we found threatened plant species. Okay, and in both cases, it was the Indo-Malayan cities that supported the greatest number of threatened bird and plant species. And more recent research has actually underlined the value of cities as actual hotspots for threatened species. There's some work from Chris Ayres, which focused on Australia, and you can have a look at that, and I can share that if you're interested. So not only are cities providing, supporting large number of species, they can also support endangered species as well. Just quickly, because this is quite an important really, we're also interested in what factors actually best predicted the bird and plant diversity were found in cities. And especially we're interested in whether these factors were anthropogenic, so were they man-made factors, or were they non-anthropogenic factors? Okay, I think I've got an example of what we mean here. So by anthropogenic, we mean things like the age of the city, and also the percent of land cover, whether it's urban land or intact vegetation. So this matters because I guess if there's anthropogenic factors that are important, it means that actually as humans, we have an ability to potentially to manage these factors or to change them. Okay. Whereas there's these non-anthropogenic factors, which it's going to be hard for us to do anything about. So the geography, the latitude of the city, the climate in which the city is set in, and things like the topography. Okay. And don't worry too much about the detail here, but the take-home message really is that actually it was these anthropogenic factors which were most important in explaining bird and plant density within cities. Okay, and what we find is that birds, we see fewer bird species where there's greater urban land cover, and we also see that more intact vegetation and actually older cities is associated with more plant species. And what this actually tells us is that it really underlines the importance of protecting remnant habitat and also restoring natural habitat in cities. So it's important. We can actually manage as sort of urban land managers. We can do something about the biodiversity in our cities. So it's actually very, very encouraging. And this work sort of continues. These are some other sort of colleagues in the US, and I just like the name of this paper because it it talks about the fact, for a long time, cities were talked about as biological deserts, and they sort of really show that this actually is a fallacy, and that cities can actually contribute a lot more than we think to biodiversity within our regions. Okay. Now, I want to move on just quickly to a second case study. This is a UK case study. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I know we've got a talk coming up about this in the new year. But this is actually a study that was done in the UK, and this is basically, we're interested in how do sort of urban pollinator communities compared to those that are found in farms and nature reserves. Okay, so to do this, we actually studied 12 cities across the country, so from Dundee in Scotland right down to Southampton on the south coast there. And in each of these locations, we studied a sort of a 1 square kilometre of urban land and also a square kilometre of nearby farmland and nearby nature reserves. So we had 36 sites across the country. And Catherine Baldock is the lead researcher here. This work was published back in 2015, and you can find the details there. But the key result, okay, so first of all, we looked at all of the pollinator taxa together, so all the different types of pollinators together. At the top there, you can see the abundance, the total abundance of insects across the the 3 different habitats, so urban, farms, and nature reserves. And on the bottom, you can see the species richness. Now, although you can see a trend here for urban areas to support both a lower abundance and a lower species richness, actually, when we ran the statistics, there wasn't any significant difference there. Okay, so what we then did was actually say, well, what happens if we look at the different groups of taxa separately? Okay, so we looked at bees and hoverflies, for example, and what we actually see here is some significant results. So in the middle, at the bottom here, you can actually see this is the species richness of bees, and we actually find that the species richness of bees in urban areas is significantly higher compared to farmland. Okay, so bee species richness was higher in urban areas than in farmland. However, it was a different story for hoverflies. In this case, we found that hoverfly abundance was significantly lower in urban areas compared to farms and nature reserves. So what this tells us, first of all, is that it's complicated. Okay, different types of species respond in different ways to urbanization. It may be that bees are more generalist. Hoverflies, for example, have a much more often have much more complicated larval habitat requirements and things like that. But there are sort of many different things we can talk about that could be driving these patterns. As I said, I don't want to talk about that in too much detail because there's going to be a talk by Catherine Baldock. I believe it's on the 17th of January, and she's going to talk a lot more about this work and all the different research questions we're studying. So do come on board for that and find out how we can enhance our cities for pollinators. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to think about, actually, we've talked about the importance of cities for biodiversity, but let me think about quickly, what sort of benefits does biodiversity actually bring to people in cities? And this is actually now a really growing area of research. Okay, so I really like this this sort of conceptual framework that was produced by Deerbert, Bourne and Kark back in 2010, and they put these sort of various different reasons or motivations for conserving urban biodiversity onto a continuum. So at the top here we have sort of benefits to nature, benefits to biodiversity, and on the bottom we have the benefits to humans. Okay, and we've already talked about, I guess, things at the top here, how actually if we can protect habitats, we can see important populations of biodiversity or rare endangered species actually occurring in cities. Okay, so that's one end of this sort of spectrum or continuum. But the other end, we start to see how, if we're providing natural habitat in cities, we provide opportunities for people to connect with nature. We also have the ability for ecosystem services to be provided, and ultimately we're looking at the benefits to human health and well-being. Really now in recent years, there's been a lot of research that's started to emerge to show that the urban green spaces can be very, very beneficial to people in terms of the delivery of ecosystem services. Okay, so not the focus of the talk today, but there's a lot of examples here. So things like the importance of urban vegetation, also soil for carbon sequestration. Okay, the role that foliage can provide in buffering against noise. Green walls can protect against UV radiation, so they can cool in summer and warm in winter. Tree planting can reduce flooding. There's a whole host of examples that we can go into here. But ultimately, really, it's this idea that accessible and high quality urban green spaces are really, really important for human health and well-being. And as I said, I haven't really got time to go into the detailed research on this topic, okay, but there's a recent review, and this was published a couple of years ago now, which is trying to understand the impact of green space and biodiversity on human health. And we can see here that a review of nearly 200 studies, 78% of those studies found a positive correlation between some sort of interaction with green space that people are doing and their mental and physical health. But a really important thing to say is that there have been many fewer studies that have looked at sort of the impacts of biodiversity on health, and this is a really complicated issue, and this is partly because people have limited ability to actually be able to accurately perceive biodiversity. Okay, so really interesting topic that, and again, that's an active area of research. I just wanted to sort of finish this section when we're talking about the value of biodiversity for cities with a somewhat controversial slide, just to think about the actual economic value. Okay, so increasingly now we're seeing that policymakers are keen to see a monetary value on sort of green space, on nature, on biodiversity. This is an example from Birmingham. This is this idea of natural capital accounting. So there's some sort of headline figures here. We can see that, for example, every £1 that is invested in parks and green spaces in Birmingham returns over £24 to society. The annual net benefit of Birmingham's parks and green spaces to society is nearly 600 million. And the total health benefits provided by these parks and green spaces over 25 years is valued at nearly 4.6 billion. Okay, and this is just taking into account, for example, the fact that if we're active within parks, we have a healthier lifestyle, we have a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, obesity, all these other sort of health factors. Okay, so we are increasingly now seeing a leaning towards this sort of monetary valuation of nature. We can either sort of embrace that, I guess, or disagree with it, but certainly I think it is a useful tool especially for when we're communicating with policymakers. Okay, nearly finished now. I realise I'm running out of time. So I just want to finish, I guess, with a few, just to touch on some of the sort of challenges and some of the real issues that we will have to grapple with when we're trying to think about, well, how can we actually maximise our biodiversity within cities? So there's three main things I just want to quickly touch on. The first is that we might have to deal with trade-offs between biodiversity and ecosystem services. So we have to think about, what do we prioritise? It may be that we can't maximise the provision of biodiversity and all these other services at the same time. So how do we choose which one we want to do? There's also this idea that nature within cities can also provide disservices. That's a challenge to our sort of urban green space managers. And finally, just to touch on this idea that biodiversity within cities is often it's unequally distributed across different sectors of society. Okay, and this has huge implications for environmental justice within cities. Okay, so trade-offs. Okay, so as I said, if we want to maximize biodiversity within the city, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can increase ecosystem service provision at the same time. Okay, sometimes we can get a situation where if we want to maximize a specific ecosystem service, we're better off only having sort of one or two species. And there's an example here of short rotation coppice in Leicester. Okay, so there was this team of researchers here. They modelled the sort of the value of short rotation coppice for carbon storage, carbon sequestration in Leicester, and they found that actually having only 2 species of tree would actually outperform the current tree stock by an order of 12, I think it was. Okay, so basically, in this case, having only 2 species was maximizing the value for carbon sequestration. Obviously, that wasn't ideal for biodiversity. So these are just a taste of the difficult decisions that policymakers, managers within urban green spaces have to decide. What is it that they're prioritizing? And of course, different people prioritize different things as well. Okay, ecosystem disservices, just quickly, this is the idea that actually ecosystems can often provide functions, or there can be components of those ecosystems that are actually negative for well-being, human well-being. Okay, a very well-known example, for example, would be allergic reactions. Those of you who suffer from hay fever can know that it could be a nightmare to go out spring and summer into sort of an urban green space because of all of the wind-pollinated plants. Other people may see sort of shrubberies and trees within parks actually as unsafe because people can hide behind those, for example. In some places as well, diseases are transmitted by animals in urban green spaces. Not so much a problem maybe in Newcastle, but certainly in tropical areas of the world. Malaria is obviously a big risk, things like that. And of course, biodiversity can also directly damage pavements and things like that. And there's a well-known example here from Newcastle actually, and this is the kittiwakes. Okay, so you'll all know, I think, that the Tyne Bridge has the largest sort of inland colony of kittiwakes in the world. Very, very important population of a declining species. Okay, but what you've got there is a sort of a rear end view of the kittiwake, and you can see that there's actually, it's not particularly pleasant to be sitting underneath the kittiwake in summer, especially if you're in a beer garden or whatever it might be, enjoying a meal, and then you have an unwelcome package land on you. Okay, so clearly there are some issues there with the kittiwakes roosting on the Tyne Bridge and the vicinity there. And finally, I just want to touch on this idea of unequal access to green space and unequal access to biodiversity. Okay, so disadvantaged sectors of society often suffer from poor provision of green space and biodiversity. And this is an example of the tree canopy cover in Newcastle. And we can see on the right-hand side that some sort of wards like Jesmond in particular has nearly 30% tree cover, whereas nearby wards like Walker, I think is about 12.8%. Okay, so big differences in tree canopy provision across the different wards. And that's just an example there of tree canopy. Here's some examples from some different cities. On the left-hand side here, we have access to green space in Bradford, and we can see that there's much greater access to NGA here as the nearest accessible green space. And we can see that actually it's in white neighbourhoods that access to green space is greater in Bradford. And on the right-hand side is a very similar story in Baltimore in the US, where actually it's predominantly black neighbourhoods have a much lower density of parks and green space. So a very similar story. So it's really quite disturbing statistics here. And I just want to finish this with a study that I was involved in a few years ago now. And this was actually a sort of a review, a systematic review of what we know about the relationship here in particular between socioeconomic status, so people's especially neighbourhood income, and biodiversity. And this was a study that was carried out across 34 cities. And what we found is that in over 60% of the cases we studied, we found this positive relationship between socioeconomic status and biodiversity. So this idea that wealthier neighbourhoods supported greater levels of biodiversity. Okay, and what we try to do in this particular research paper is go on to think about, if we can identify the specific conditions in which access to biodiversity is more or less unequal, we can also then understand how to overcome that problem and try to create more equitable access to biodiversity across our cities. Okay, so I think that's pretty much all I was going to say. So just to finish with some take-home messages. just quickly, I think we've seen and we've covered this idea that although urbanisation poses a substantial threat to biodiversity, cities can also support many species. Okay, we've seen birds and plants and pollinators, many of which can also be endangered and rare as well. And the crucial thing is that having biodiversity in cities is really, really important for both the provision of ecosystem services and more generally for our health and well-being. And this is actually a really important active area of research. So I think it's absolutely vital that cities as a whole respond to this biodiversity crisis. And I think it's important just to finally emphasize that we all have a role to play in that. So any of us, if we have a garden, if we have a balcony, maybe at school, we have school grounds, okay, there's things that we can do to improve those green spaces, and then cumulatively we start to see impacts and benefits for biodiversity. Okay, I think that's me finished, Peter. So hopefully there's some questions. I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions, Mark, and about 5 minutes for going through those. Thanks, first of all, Mark, for that fascinating talk, and particularly that pulling at the end to the link between poorer neighbourhoods and lack of access to biodiversity and green space. If you think of lockdown last year, it's the multiple deprivation areas that were not able to go out of the flats and actually contact nature. Alistair, apologies, I missed you. Actually gave the right answer about majority becoming urban. That's there. Thanks for the questions. Vasek's first question was, does biodiversity cover only wildlife? What about domestic or semi-domestic feral species, cats and dogs, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question, Vasek. I think in most of those studies that I've been talking about here, we tend to just to talk about those, often those what we call those spontaneous species, things that haven't been sort of deliberately planted in the case of plants, but also things like domestic. When it comes to the domestic species, there's been an awful lot of research on how especially things like cats can impact on bird and mammal populations. So we do study them, but it tends to be in terms of the impact that they might have on more native species. If that answers the question. Another important thing just to touch on really quickly there. As someone who's done quite a lot of work on pollinators, we've actually got a PhD student who's just started, Federica, who's going to be looking at the impact of honeybees on native pollinators. Now, honeybees are essentially domestic species. Okay, they're managed species. They're introduced in the UK. So obviously there's an awful lot of them. There's an awful lot of them now in cities as well. Urban beekeeping is quite an important area. So yeah, it's quite a nuanced sort of situation, but I think I guess the important thing is to try and understand the impact that those sort of domestic or managed species can have on native biodiversity.
A comment that was made about the importance of urban edgelands and wildlife interacting, bears, presumably not in the UK, deer, etc. Although I would say that certainly not so long ago I saw deer running straight past Shire Mall metro station, which was slightly surprising, and urban fox populations are quite huge in major cities that was there. Comment about the London and the idea of making cities national park. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I've not been involved in that national park city, but yeah, I like the idea. I think anything that really underlines the value and gets people thinking differently about the value of urban habitats. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I don't know why we all shouldn't have this idea of a national park city. I mean, I guess it gets back to this idea of what should national parks be, and actually, I mean, I live quite near the Yorkshire Dales, and if you look at many parts of that, there's not very much natural habitat there at all. A lot of it is just sheep, sheep pasture. So, in that cases, parts of cities can often be more diverse than even our traditional national parks. So yeah, why not? I'm all for it. Yeah.
And 80% of us are urban in the UK, and that's the nature that's there.
Absolutely, yeah.
Again, there's a comment about vacant wasteland sites being good places for biodiversity. Although it's interesting, we tend to think of those as artificial rather than farmland, which is intensively managed, is natural. Discuss. Not all cities being similar in terms of richness of biodiversity. Is that something you found in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a big difference. I think in that study that I talked about, the global scale study, we had somewhere like Singapore, which I think, if I remember rightly, has 300 or 400 different species. And then of birds, I think it was, and then somewhere obviously like the UK, somewhere much further northern hemisphere, we're talking often less than 100 species. So there are those latitudinal gradients of biodiversity that come into play. Whatever we do in somewhere like Newcastle, we're not going to have more bird species than Singapore. So you're absolutely right. It's just about trying to maximize the amount of species that we can get relative to what's in the surrounding regional sort of species pool.
Relative to that geographical region we are in the world. And
exactly.
A link to his paper on urban animal species.
I'll have a look at that.
I'll pass that message on, and I'll download the comments. There'll be notes of those. It does take us to past. So Mark, at that point, to say thank you very much for the talk and getting us to think more about our cities and where we live. Looking forward, we have a gap now in terms of talks. And then we have a series of talks that are going to be coming up in January. That's there. The one you mentioned earlier was in terms of pollinators by Catherine Baldock, which I believe is on the 17th. We are organising the first talk in early January. We've still got a date for those, but we'll send out information as soon as possible. And the week of the 20th, on Monday, there's a talk on environmental impact assessment and how you assess the impact of new development, which fits quite nicely with that urbanisation theme that you're talking about going forward. So I said we finish at past. It's now 16, I've missed it, sorry. But can I get everyone to thank Mark for his talk today? And if you weren't able to hear today's talk, a lot of people now watch it online. We will upload this in the next few days to the Tyne and Weir GA website. So Mark, thanks again for getting us to think about the place we live and the wildlife around us.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, everyone. Happy Christmas. And